All right, so today what we're going to do is we're going to look at colonialism from an economic perspective. So, first of all, we're going to talk about the impact of colonialism on the European economy, and then we're going to talk about this idea of mercantilism, which is an economic theory, and we're going to explain how it motivated policy. All right, so let's talk about the impact first. So, the biggest impact on the European economy was this thing called the price revolution. And what this was a period of inflation that occurred in the 16th and early 17th centuries, so 1500s and 1600s. And what inflation is a rise in the level of prices. And you don't need to understand too much about how inflation works, but know that inflation occurs essentially when you dump a bunch of money into the economy, which is precisely what happened when the New World was quote unquote discovered by Europeans. So Europeans brought in all this gold and silver, and that lowered the value of money, which caused a rise in the level of prices. And what you really need to understand is the impact that this had on people, and it wasn't evenly distributed. So food prices rose faster than wages, which hurt workers who earned wages, right? Whether it was agricultural workers or urban workers, it hurt them the most. So they couldn't afford food. There was hunger, there was starvation, and all of that, right? And governments, in response to this, sort of decrease in the value of money, they raised taxes because they needed to keep taking in money, right? And what this did is it put even more pressure on workers, so it caused all kinds of discontent. Now, on the other hand, merchants and nobles really benefited. Merchants, because they're the ones trading, they benefit from this rise in the level of prices. And then nobles benefited because they made their money from rent. So they just kept raising rents and putting even more pressure on peasants, especially. All right, so let's talk about some big changes that occurred in the European economy as a result of colonialism. So, what we're going to see here is this beginning of commercial capitalism. So, the economy is increasingly based on business and commerce. It's not completely based on it, but we're starting to see this shift sort of away from agriculture and towards business, trade, commerce, and all of that. We also see the beginnings of a truly global economy. So now Europe and the Americas and Asia and Africa are all connected by trade. And the leaders in this trade are the Dutch, the French, and the English. So at the beginning of this period, right, we mentioned that the Spanish and the Portuguese were leaders in trade, but we're going to see that power start to shift towards Northern Europe. One of the other things that we're going to see is this invention of something called a joint stock company. And what this was a company that isn't owned by a single person, but is instead owned by a bunch of shareholders. So these still exist today. If you want, you can go out and buy stock in a company like Apple. So you go out and you buy a little tiny part of a company. And the reason why this is important is because it made trade less risky. So it further fueled that rise of economies based on business and trade, right? And the reason why it made it less risky is because it spread out the risk, right? So if you own stock in the British or the, let's say, Dutch East India Company, and you send out a trading vessel and that ship sinks and it doesn't bring back any profits, right? Well, the sort of the financial consequences of that, you having to buy a new ship and all of that, that's not just placed entirely on the owner. Instead, because the company is owned by many people, everyone is paying in a little bit, right, to help solve that problem. So the financial consequences are more spread out, which makes trade less risky. We're also going to see that sort of going along with this, not only are the rise of joint stock company, but we also see the rise of stock exchanges, which are institutions where you can buy and sell stock in companies, and these still exist today. We're also going to see, going along with this, the rise of large government-supported banks. So what these do is they provide loans to companies, so again, helping facilitate that rise of commercial capitalism. And a big example of this that you'll see start to pop up again and again is the Bank of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Now, that's not to say that everything changes, though. So a lot of things really do remain the same. So even though the economy is starting to shift towards business and commerce, really it's still mostly dependent on agriculture. So as we mentioned, right, serfdom as an institution is on the decline. But even though serfs aren't necessarily legally tied to the land anymore, a lot of peasants still owe money to their landlords. They owe money to the state. So things aren't really changing all that much for them. And then trade, all that profit from trade doesn't really trickle down to the peasants, so they don't see a lot of benefit from this. So life is changing a lot for some people, but for the most part, it stays the same for a lot of people. All right. So, last but not least, let's talk about mercantilism, which was this economic policy that really motivated a lot of European, or economic theory rather, that motivated a lot of economic policy during this time period. And the foundation of this theory was this idea that nations can secure power, money, and status or glory by ensuring a favorable balance of trade. So, there's three big goals of mercantilist policy. The first one is to get as much bullion, which is gold and silver, as possible. The second goal is to establish a favorable balance of trade. And what this means is you want to be having more exports, so you want to be sending more goods out of your country than imports or taking goods into your country. So you want to be sending out more stuff than you're taking in. And the third goal is to become self sufficient. And so, this is a big reason why countries were interested in gaining colonies. It wasn't just about the glory, it also had an economic benefit, or so they thought. So, they thought what they could do is they could create sort of this closed loop between sort of the home country and the colony. So, the home country would use the colonies for raw materials. So, they'd import, I don't know, like Britain actually did this a lot because Britain's really small. It doesn't have tons and tons of like wood and timber available to build boats and things like that. So one of the reasons why they sort of developed colonies in what is today the United States, right, is they wanted to import timber. So they would import timber to Britain, use it, manufacture stuff, and then sell those manufactured goods back to the Americas. So again, you're kind of this closed loop with your colony. You're using them for raw materials, and then you're using them for markets for the goods that you produce back in the home country. Now, here are the tools of mercantilist policy. This is how governments enforced those goals or met those goals. So, one of the ways they did, right? So, they don't like imports, right? We know that. So, what they did to discourage imports is they taxed them. So, it became more expensive to import goods into your country. And a tax on imports is called a tariff. So, you'll see that word pop up a lot. Now, remember, they like exports, though. So, what they did to encourage exports is they actually had a variety of policies that they used. So, first of all, they basically supported local industries by giving them money. And when a government gives money to basically a local industry or a person, that's called a subsidy. So, they gave subsidies to local industries. They also built infrastructure. So, infrastructure, that's just things like roads or canals or stuff like that. So, what that does, right, is like if you want to encourage exports to another country, well, then you'll build a road from your country to the other country, right? So, you'll make that easier. And then they supported trading enterprises or trading companies. And we mentioned that, right, that companies, like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were supported by the government. All right, but what were the consequences of this policy? Well, first of all, right, we already mentioned the price revolution was caused by, or partly by, countries hoarding too much gold and silver, right? So if you dump a bunch of gold and silver into your economy, you might think that's helpful. It's actually not. It leads to inflation, right? It also led to literal wars as well as trade wars. So in terms of literal wars, you might remember like the French and Indian War, right? So that was a war between the British and the French over colonial holdings in North America, right? So it's going to contribute to literal wars. It's also going to contribute to trade wars. So what this is when basically countries start to, engage in wars over exports and imports. So for example, if you're trying to discourage imports, maybe you will place a tax on imports from another country. That country might get mad at you, and then they'll place a tariff on your imports, right? So you'll start fighting over that. So this happened a lot back during this time period that we're talking about. They actually still happen today, so just ask China about that.